Hi, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in today's webinar, Energy Futures 2023 Nonprofit Best Practices for Equitable Community Solar. I'm Alicia Hill, and I'm excited to be here with you today for an informative presentation and discussion centered around opportunities available to nonprofits who want to spur equitable community solar development. Today, our team will share a high-level overview of common challenges for nonprofits that were identified in the LIFT research, examples of project models that overcame specific challenges, and nonprofit-specific project finance tips. They will also share insight into how key financing mechanisms have been used to deliver successful projects across the country. These insights are compiled during the creation of the LIFT Toolkit. LIFT is a project that is for accelerating low-income financing and transactions for solar access everywhere. And this was a DOE-funded project. This project was led by Groundswell in collaboration with Elevate, Clean Energy Works, and Southbase. The goal of LIFT is to highlight optimal community solar program designs and financing structures for low and moderate income residential households in each common regulatory and utility service environment. If you have a question at any time during this presentation, please let us know in the chat. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to welcome Elvis, Moleka, and Sara Owre to the screen. Uh, and and they will actually be sharing the presentation today. And Dr. Moleka is Groundswell's Vice President of Labs and Data Science, and Sara Owre is Groundswell's Program Manager of Labs and Data Science. Over to you both.
Thank you, Alicia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Energy Futures webinar series, where we will be discussing the LIFT Toolkit and resources that can be found within the toolkit for nonprofit community solar developers. As Alicia mentioned, these insights for the presentation today were compiled through the 3-year LIFT research project, which culminated in the LIFT Toolkit launched to the public in November last year. This is actually our second webinar in the series on the LIFT Toolkit. And if you missed the first webinar, you can click this link in the slide we will share out after the presentation to go explore the toolkit itself, as well as a step-by-step demonstration of how to use the tool. Just to give some very high level points for the toolkit in case we have folks in the audience who are not familiar. The LIFT Toolkit is essentially a database of low to moderate income community solar projects in the United States. So we have 453 projects in our database serving 18 states. The toolkit incorporates a GIS mapping tool as well as a decision support tool, and then finally some resources to continue your learning in community solar development. So where we focused on how to use the tool in the last webinar, we really wanted to pull out some specific tools and resources that nonprofit developers can take and deploy in their own community solar initiatives in this webinar. And so I will now orient us on our agenda for today. Elvis is going to kick us off with some context for this webinar. So why did we choose to focus on the nonprofit audience specifically, how some of these findings fit into the larger conversation on optimal community solar program design, as well as touching a bit on the IRA and implications for the rollout of new ITC rules. Then we will move into a couple examples of successful project financing solutions through LIFT case study examples. And we have 3 that we will highlight there. Then Elvis will talk us through some of the project financing best practices that were defined in these case studies. And just to pause and again mention, our toolkit has over 20 case studies on successful programs from our database, and the financing best practices were determined through that research on the case studies. And so we pulled common themes and then defined these best practices as a list that developers can take and implement. And so after Elvis walks us through the specific best practices that are mentioned in these case studies, we will then switch over to some successful examples of customer engagement, community engagement models through 2 case study examples. So we have a lot to get through, a lot of granular detail on some of these projects that we really want to share out with you. But we will save as much time as we can at the end for questions. With that, over to you, Elvis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sara. So first, we just want to start by just laying the foundation why non-profit developers are really essential as for the transmission mechanism of clean energy projects. So in a recent study conducted by Clean Energy Group, what they found or highlighted is that approximately up to 90% of the solar developments in the country are being conducted by affordable housing as well as community-based organizations. And so what that implies is that nonprofits are really central or core in terms of advancing community solar projects across the country. But more importantly, they do that in a more targeted approach, specifically looking at the LMI population. And from what we found from the LIFT research is that community solar is one of the fastest growing segments in the industry right now. And we have experienced successes from the LIFT solar projects, how that a particular LEAF project can be used in so many ways, from the decision support framework, from the optimizer framework, as well as just exploring projects and learning more about how it can serve in terms of pre-development. And there are definitely multiple uses and users of the toolkit. So in the next slides, I want us to look at more specifically the ICT in perspective. And I want to say, actually, there are three periods here, although I want to talk about two. So we have the Inflation Reduction Act, we have the current Inflation Reduction Act framework. There is definitely the Post-Inflation Reduction Act, which I don't want to discuss now because of the implementation framework. So as I will discuss later on, as we will see later, is that although the Inflation Reduction Act has been enacted, what matters right now are the implementation part of it. So prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, we understood that it was really complex in terms of the financing structures. For example, the tax equity framework for non-profits in particular to be able to understand how to access, maybe, for example, the ITC. But looking at the demonstration in terms of the graphical representation, we see how that is going to spur development, not just from clean energy programs, but also from the climate change perspective. So we know that, for example, that inflation, with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, the ITC is going to stay at a constant rate of 30% right up to 2032. And so this is really important because there are two goals here: from the inclusive perspective, where we have equity, and also from the climate perspective, where we talk more about decarbonization goals. But one thing I want to stress here, as we'll see throughout this presentation, is about the implementation of some of these policies as well as best practices. So with that, I would like to share some few challenges that we observe from the LEAF Finance report. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing, as we see, we'll try as much as possible, as Sarah did mention, to look at how we can deploy some of these best practices, especially for non-profit community solar developers. But what we found is that there is really no standardization when it comes to financing mechanism that scales projects, although there are some specific financing framework that are suited for non-profit developers of community solar projects. One of the limitations that we saw in terms of barriers is just difficulties financing smaller projects. And we're going to shade more opportunities how nonprofits can take advantage of that to be able to maximize it or leverage it to their advantage. There was also host site negotiation, including navigating affordable housing regulations, and also in addition to the time needed to structure and execute deals. But we also found from the LEAF Finance research that up to 97% of community solar projects took advantage of tax benefits. So our goal in this presentation is to be able to demonstrate vividly how we can monetize, for example, the ITC, be it in terms of partnership or finding organizations that have a tax appetite. So I will now let Sarah walk us through some successful nonprofits that really navigated some of these finance barriers to be able to increase customer satisfaction as well as higher customer savings for their subscribers.
Thanks, Elvis. So our first case study example that we wanted to highlight is the Orlando Utilities Commission New Horizons apartment complex in Orlando, Florida. The key partners in this project were the municipal utility, OUC, the city of Orlando, and the nonprofit property owner, the Hope Church, which was a locally based nonprofit entity. This project was an overall larger renovation project to turn 58 previously vacant units into affordable housing for homeless families and veterans. The project incorporated a solar installation generating 52.2 kilowatt AC, and incorporated with energy and water efficiency upgrades to the building, as well as an overall sustainability goals integrated as well in the renovation of a community garden and native landscaping. Another interesting component of this project was that each unit was individually net metered, thereby directly delivering solar credits to the tenants of each unit. and also allowed the tenants to roll over credits to future months. Now, while the units were each individually net metered, the tenants didn't technically own their units, so the Hope Church had to step up to own the installation itself in addition to the overall building ownership. And they were more incentivized to do so because of the overall sustainability goals of this renovation project. As we know, as Elvis mentioned, neither the property owner, the Hope Church, nor the utility were able to leverage the ITC directly. And so they came up with a more creative way to finance this project. And what they settled on was the OUC actually had been saving up their energy efficiency program rebates and had $60,000 in savings that they worked with the city of Orlando to put towards the solar component of this project. And the city also matched that dollar for dollar. So just to chat through some of the success factors here was really relied on a strong partnership between the city, church, and municipality. And we really saw a kind of full buy-in of this to the sustainability impacts. You know, OUC had an overall sustainability agenda and really wanted to prioritize LED lighting, efficiency appliances, high efficiency water heaters, and HVAC. And so they were able to provide the tenants with all of these efficiency appliances, efficiency upgrades. But in addition, through this package and stacking on the solar, we're also able to deliver monthly bill savings to the tenants as well. So our next example is the Coyote Ridge Solar Farm in Colorado. The key partners for this project were the Poudre Valley Rural Electric Association, PVREA, the Colorado Energy Office, which I will refer to as CEO, and then Grid Alternatives. This project delivered an installation generating 1.95 megawatts of electricity on an active landfill. And as Elvis mentioned, some of the host site negotiations being a complication, I'll talk about in just a second because that was really key in this project. And then they also diversified their project allocations. So something we see across we see pretty regularly in community solar projects. They dedicated 700 kilowatts to the income qualified portion of their subscriber base, 500 kilowatts to local nonprofit businesses, and then the remaining 750 to market rate subscribers. The income qualified subscribers were able to participate through PVREA's PV for All program and were ultimately reached 140 households. And these customers saw an average of 30% savings. The financing for this project, the CEO put forward a $200,000 grant, and then PVREA financed the remaining portion, $2.4 million through a leaseback structure with CoBank. Again, not able to take advantage of the ITC directly, but through this leaseback structure that was created for 12 years, they were able to leverage the ITC as well as modified accelerated cost recovery system, MACRS, and thereby deliver the savings levels to the income qualified customers. The success factors here, really optimizing this financing model. So through the coordination between the grant from the CEO as well as this leaseback structure, and then by diversifying the portfolio to create no-cost subscriptions for income qualified customers, but then having the market rate and nonprofit entities pay upfront and monthly subscription fees really allowed savings to immediately be realized for the income qualified customers. And then back on that siting piece, this was sited on an active landfill. Took over 9 acres of land, and which bumped them into a category where they had to go through special permitting assessment. But because the landfill, Larimer County had already done the assessment for the landfill site, they were able to avoid that excess cost as well as community dissatisfaction with this being sited, taking up too much space. And then finally, there was a local permitting requirement that all of the generated capacity stay on the local grid. And so they sited this in an area with adequate and growing electric demand. Again, just emphasizing that how that diversified portfolio really facilitated that. So then our final example of a successful project financing case study is the Onset Shared Solar Project based in Massachusetts. Key partners here were Blue Hub Energy, which is a nonprofit community development financial institute in Massachusetts, Borrego Solar, who supported the construction, Eversource as the utility, and then Eastern Bank, who provided some of the debt financing for BHE, as well as Housing Partnership for Housing Solutions for Southeastern Massachusetts, which I'll talk about in just a second. So BHE has an offsite solar installation located in historic waterfront towns, generating 2.782 megawatts DC. They sell these credits generated from the solar installations to 24 affordable housing developments at a 20% discount. And this generates an average of 500 a year net metering credits to households as bill credits on their Eversource bill. 56 households are currently served on this project. Again, talking about the financing piece of this, as a nonprofit entity, they sought out a partnership flip structure so that they could leverage some of the tax incentives. So they created a special purpose entity in which a tax investor purchased a non-controlling interest for the 7-year tax compliance period. And through that, we're able to receive the ITC as well as accelerated depreciation. The tax investor also purchased New Markets tax credits for the remaining cost of capital, which lowered the sponsor equity that would have been required, thereby allowing them to deliver higher level of off-taker savings from the start. And then, as I mentioned, BHE also purchased debt financing from Eastern Bank to cover any additional capital costs, and these were repaid from the solar cash flow pretty quickly. After the 7-year period, BHE will buy out the investor and control the installation. So, just to talk through the success factors again, not only the New Markets tax credit, not only did it deliver additional equity and immediately greater savings to off-takers, it also allowed the project to feel confident in maintaining their pricing and savings mechanism after the 7-year compliance period. We also, as I mentioned, Housing Solutions, as the property manager for these affordable housing units, was a really trusted resource to go out and enable that recruitment period, explain how the savings mechanisms would be delivered, and really supported the customer recruitment phase. And then finally, in Massachusetts, virtual net metering allows solar developers to sell these credits to customers for signing through a signed contract. And BHE piloted with this project a way to deliver these credits directly to low to moderate income customers without requiring them to pay or sign a contract. And they are now advocating for changes in the SMART program in Massachusetts to facilitate this mechanism in future projects. So now I will turn it over to Elvis to talk through some of these best practices and how we can deploy them.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Sarah. So the first project that Sarah highlighted was the Orlando Utility Commission. First, I want to say that incentives differ based on different state regulations as well as county. So the first thing that I want to say here is how to apply it from a non-profit perspective. Now, every state or county, for example, we have any federal energy efficiency rebate, to offset the cost of upfront costs. But I want to say that where nonprofits can really take advantage, because for that to set in, there are certain minimum requirements or threshold for local incentives to be able to really actualize. So, and set more often at times, this is depending on probably the system size or energy production. So I think there is a competitive advantage if nonprofits at least meet those minimum requirements set by their state for the local incentive, or to some extent probably exceed them, because if not, they won't be able to really actualize some of these benefits. And the main reason why this is really important is that federal energy efficiency, it kind of offset the cost of initial cost of installation, and this is a huge impediment when it comes to solar installation, especially for low income household, where upfront cost is usually something that really prevents the further development of community solar projects, especially for residential household. Then the second mechanism here that I think is really important are innovative financing structures such as on-bill financing as well as on-bill repayment. What this implies is that a utility or a private lender funds capital to be able for a developer to be able to develop an energy efficiency program or renewable energy program. And that is usually paid through regular payment on an existing utility bill. The advantage of this program is that there's usually zero or very little interest rates. And compared to other financing structures that are very complex, this is just a simple contract. And in addition to that, it is very suitable for small developers. One of the disadvantage of on-bill financing is that people always talk about the financing structure as well. So if a non-profit is interested in developing, for example, a smaller project, then I will say taking advantage of on-bill financing is usually one of the pathways or mechanisms. And the fact that the payment is done through an existing bill payment is which just imply that there's a streamlined process already. So this is one of the things that non-profits can really leverage. Another financing mechanism which is also suitable in this case is the property access clean energy. So what this implies is that it's a finance for upfront costs, and that is usually paid over time, over a period of time. So, and usually these are available through green banks, like Sarah did mention for Orlando Utility Commission. And Sarah did mention as well the aspect of no cost site lease. So I want to say this is really important. So basically, these are negotiations where a non-profit developer, for example, negotiates on maybe a vacant property or a vacant space, for example. And so what that implies is that it doesn't imply that there are no upfront costs. Definitely there are upfront costs, but it reduces operating costs to a greater extent because there is that power negotiation about bringing or maybe it could be a rooftop, for example. So I think the no cost side lease opportunities are really important for smaller developers, especially non-profit developers. Let's look at the next slide, please. Okay, so in this example, there are a couple of things here that kind of relates to the Inflation Reduction Act as well as state grants. One of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act does, especially when it comes to ICT, is that there is a direct payment option, which implies that non-profit developers can receive upfront payment directly rather than through a tax credit. And what this implies is that, first of all, the advantage is in it kind of reduces complicated financing structure, and it creates more opportunities because one of the things that we probably want to see in the industry in general is that community ownership. So it creates more opportunity for community ownership models, be it from just solar or with the solar and storage perspective, thinking of resiliency in that case. Now, how can non-profit developers really apply some of this? The first thing here is the energy efficiency is really important. I'm going to talk about energy efficiency as well as resilient power. Now, thinking of the ICT in perspective, so it currently stands at 30%. But where the advantage and the opportunities really lies is if non-profit developers can take advantage of certain LMI communities, because there is an adder on the ICT component of the Inflation Reduction Act, which grants up to 20%. So thinking of it in terms of higher tax credit or cost reduction, so we have the initial 30%, and we also have additional 20%. And this is where the opportunity zone to play. So the asset depreciation opportunity zone. So because by taking advantage of certain opportunity zones, which differs in terms of the eligibility requirements, is that they now stand a better chance of getting more tax savings. Now, the other thing is about the environmental justice part of it. So, this certain census tract, for example, so they could vary depending on magnitude, for example. So they could be designated as environmental justice areas. So I think this is really a pathway for adoption of application. So which not only will it spur development of community solar projects, but it will also spur that sustainability that we need, and as well as bring about equity and an inclusive community. Now, I also want to stress that it is very important for state grants to be geared towards affordable solar access, because one of the things that we talk often, especially when it comes to bill savings, is the aspect of reducing electricity costs. And I want to strongly highlight Groundswell subscriber management services here through the DOEE as a very successful program that has really reduced electricity costs and savings for household up to almost $500 per year. That is extremely huge. Now, the other opportunity for state is that we want to see more opportunities where there are more opportunities for investment of renewables, especially in disadvantaged areas. So I think strongly believe that nonprofits have advantage in this particular area. So there's an energy efficiency component which cannot be minimized, because we know what energy efficiency does in the long run, not only in terms of reducing bills, but also also want to see taking advantage of those disadvantaged areas to be able to have more or a higher tax credit. Now let's look at the third example, please. Now, for the onset shared solar, now Sarah did mention about Shreks. I want to say here there are two things in perspective. So definitely there are issue when a certain amount of kilowatt hour of electricity is generated, and there are two types of market here. There are states, for example, that don't allow Shreks to be sold, and there's also the voluntary market. So, for example, in the case of states that probably don't allow Shreks to be sold, they can use the voluntary market, but that implies that that unit will be sold at a reduced price. What that implies in terms of savings, for example, let's think of it. If I'm a customer, for example, and I sold some of my Shreks, what that implies that I have some certain amount of money that I can use to offset some of my electricity bill or costs associated with my solar. So it just adds more money into the subscriber's pocket. But there are also opportunities for taking advantage of municipal programs. So basically, one of the pathways that nonprofits can definitely use is through an affordable leasing. So, for example, because when we talk about the cost associated with this particular project, we're not just looking at installation, there are also costs associated with equipment, for example. And so, but in particular, we want to see more options where there are no down payments, and there's to some extent guaranteed savings. A very good example, I know Sarah did mention opportunities such as community development entities, but a very good example is the Connecticut Solar for All program. So what this program did was that through the Connecticut Green Bank, they paid money to a solar company, and that solar company was able to offer reduced price for installation. So that is a very good program, and that's a very good way. I know, for example, that we have the DC Solar for All project here. We have Illinois as well as Connecticut. But what we want to see more of this type of programs, that really create opportunities. Like I did mention about the new market tax credit, which is basically for certain opportunity zones, designated areas or census tracts that is usually financed through community development entities, like what Onset Share Solar did. What are some of the benefits of this mechanism? So we're going to see more scaling of solar installations for LMI household. And I did mention the aspect that it also has the tendency of offsetting the utility payments. So at this point, let's look at the customer experience report before I will call on Sarah to shed more light on specific examples. So there are two things I want to say here. From the Lyft research on customer experience, what we found out is that savings is usually the most confusing aspect. But as Sarah will explain later, savings is not the only factor, because the industry is very dynamic and the issues are multifaceted at the same time. But how we communicate savings is very important, because it has the propensity not only for increasing acquisition, but for also keeping our customers happy. And we know from what Groundswell's subscriber management services is that retention is very important. So the second aspect is how we engage. Sarah will talk us through this process more deeply about building partnerships and communication, including messaging that really target customers, and but more importantly, ensure that we go about ensuring a very inclusive community. So I will pass it on to Sarah to give us specific examples of projects that have utilized some of these findings from the LEAF research. Over to you, please, Sarah.
Thank you, Elvis. So similarly, as we did with the project financing successful solutions, we're going to walk through two case study examples that, as Elvis kind of mentioned, these two challenges that we discovered through the LIFT research, one around this education around how savings are described component, as well as ensuring we have trusted formal relationships with community-based organizations to convey these messages, are kind of intertwined. So both of these case studies speak to both of them in their own way. So our first example is the New Hampshire Solar Shares solar installation at the Apple Knockers General Store in New Hampshire. The key partners in this project was NH Solar Shares, which is a subsidiary of Plymouth Area Renewable Energy Initiative, a nonprofit community-based entity. Then the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative, NHEC, Sakasha Electric LLC, who supported the installation and construction, and then the Apple Knockers General Store, who provided the rooftop for the siting of the array. This project is relatively small, 27.6 kilowatts generated through this rooftop array, and though we can glean some pretty important learnings around the community engagement piece for this this project. So the project was 100% income dedicated to income qualified households with a 2-year participation agreement, and on average they deliver $25 to $29 in monthly bill savings on their electricity bill. So around this community engagement piece, this speaks not only to the installation of this project, but a longer term interest and dedication in educating the community around this town. I think it was in Warren, New Hampshire, around energy savings and clean energy efficiencies. So there was a local volunteer committee who assisted with the outreach and education component, who went out and recruited participants, really explaining in keywords how these savings would be delivered. And then this program also follows that up with mailers that are distributed a few times a year to their participants that describe the energy savings and how to maintain energy efficiency practices, maintain energy efficient appliances in their households. And then, I know we're in the community engagement piece, but to talk about how the funding of this program actually benefited from this well-rounded community investment in clean energy. This project cost $65,000, and a lot of this we see was donated from individuals, private institutions, as well as a fundraising program that the cooperative instituted and raised over $10,000 in individual donations through that they then matched dollar to dollar. The NHEC Foundation also funded part of the program, and the NHEC Foundation is funded through a Roundup program, which is a program by which the members of this cooperative can round up their monthly energy bill and to the nearest dollar, and then those savings, those extra dollars are sent to the foundation, which then puts them forward for clean energy programs like this one. And so, this is a relatively small project, but we really see the benefit of this investment in long-term education around clean energy, around solar energy, and not only in recruiting folks for this project in particular, but also sustaining a long-term funding mechanism for these interests going forward. In the next example, we have Anza Solar Farm in California. This project is, the main partners are the Santa Rosa Band of Cahuilla Indians in California, the Anza Electric Cooperative, Grid Alternatives, and the California Department of Community Services and Development. This is the first community scale community solar dedicated to low to moderate income households in California. And it generates 998.6 kilowatts on and is sited on tribal lands. The savings are dedicated to tribal members in the Santa Rosa Band of Cahuilla Indians, as well as low to moderate income households in the AEC territory. And these participants see a 25% discount on their electricity bills monthly. The community engagement strategies that were initiated for this project were really key to the success. Obviously, if we are siting on sensitive lands such as tribal lands, we need to have stakeholder input and buy-in from the beginning. And so that was a really key factor in getting this off the ground. All stakeholder inputs were really valued from the start, and the Santa Rosa Band of Cahuilla Indians were really integrated as a key project partner in this installation. The Grid IE and AEC, the cooperative, also provided a 6 to 8 week job training program for 5 members, tribal members, and then provided job placement services after the installation was up. So not only investing in their, ability to contribute to their own project in their own tribal lands, but also maintaining their professional development beyond the project through those placement services. And then another key part of this was that a cultural observer was integrated during the installation process, so that they could provide guidance on how to properly use land and around how to properly maintain cultural artifacts if they were discovered or came up during the installation. And then one benefit of this project was that the regulatory hurdles were eased because it was sited on tribal lands. And I just wanted to take a second to pause on this because this should, is a co-benefit, but we need to make sure that we are not going after this co-benefit in an extractive manner. So if you are looking to create a project on tribal lands that will benefit a community similar to this one, that co-benefit should be seen as like an afterthought and really integrating the community priorities from the beginning. One other piece around this, there was, rigorous savings education piece and kind of not only around how to explain the savings that would be generated from the installation, but also around sensitivity around the low to moderate income per, NOMR and perception of what that meant. And so this project, again, relied on the integrated community members and stakeholders to help explain that component and, why they might fit into that group and how this, the benefits they would be realized from this project. And with that being said, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. We're really excited to hear from you all. Any questions, comments you may have. And again, just want to highlight that, we will share these slides out at the end of the presentation, which includes links to the LIFT toolkit, as well as links to all of these case studies, so you can read through them in depth. All right. So we have a first question here. This is from Robert Dansby. Can you share contracts templates from the Joe for Sun Falmouth project? Elvis, I will hand that over to you.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for that question. I just want to say two things here. So the Jefferson farmout was a very exemplary case study because it kind of eliminated some humiliating requirements when it comes to investing in LMI population. So, for example, like credit checks, upfront costs, and installation costs. Now, the thing that is important, and this is where participation is really key, is that it requires collaboration with the project administrators to be able to see what their pro forma is or to have a template on that particular project. But from our LEAF research, the finance research in particular, so if you read that report, you realize that there were two elements of the data set. So we had data from the pro formas from a sample of projects that we selected, but it was also we also augmented that data with industry with industry data, so to be able to come up with some of these limitations and barriers. And in our first webinar, we did reiterate the fact that we would like to keep the toolkit updated. So, and I think that requires participation and collaboration with everyone involved. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks, Elvis. And I see another question in the chat. Can someone share that LMI report? I believe referring to the publications that Elvis just mentioned. So yeah, just to again highlight on the LIFT toolkit itself, you can find all of the research reports that were developed prior to the development of the toolkit, and so really informed the components of the toolkit and how we structured that. So that can be found on the Learn page of the toolkit. And I think our co-host Alicia put that in the chat, but yeah, we'll make sure to get that out when we share the slides as well. We have another question. Currently, retail electricity pricing in the PJM grid area is up about 30% versus 2019 pricing. Currently 17 cents kilowatt hour versus 10 cents. So the question is, when retail electricity prices rise, is the comparable solar credit also increased to keep pace with what utilities or generators provide? Elvis, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Brian, and thank you for that. So again, that question falls under the type of utility bill mechanism or financing mechanism employed. So I would say, for example, first of all, there is really no direct relationship between pricing. So first of all, we have to think about the retail pricing, and for example, because there are two types of segments here. We have the retail price for, especially for the non-LMI, and we have the price, which I usually call it the community solar price for the impact customers. Now let's look at two things here. Let's assume, for example, that the price associated with empower subscribers. Let's say, for example, I'll just go with its example. And now let's also look at it in the fact that if that price was to rise, let's say it went, let's say by 10 cents. Now, what we're looking is it does not really matter. So we're looking at total savings, for example, because from what research we found is that the retail price can go up and the subscribers can still have higher savings compared to maybe the price that is offered for LMI household. So I won't say there's a direct relationship. It depends on that particular part because there are two segments here that we're looking at. So comparatively to the other segment of the population, I don't know if that answers your question, but we're looking at just the retail price because the retail price, for example, can go by a smaller margin, but the subscriber will still achieve higher savings compared to the price associated with the Empower customers.
Thanks, Elvis. And we have a second question from Brian as well, which I think is also for you. With low-income housing becoming more difficult to find today, many municipalities, for example, the District of Columbia, have explicit targets for new low-energy housing. Can you comment briefly on partnership with for-profit developers who may be including a portion allocated toward low-income housing?
Yeah, so there's so many ways to answer that question, Brian, and we can stay on that question for another one. So but I'm just going to provide some key insights. So the first thing is that it's not just the housing issue in America is of concern, especially when we look at rural communities. That Groundswell has done a lot of research there. So I think this is where partnership is really important. And again, from being an economist, there's also the economic perspective of interest rate. So I think it's really important able to create affordable housing. We have to all understand that not everyone can be able to afford. So the affordable housing development is really important. And I think we should also channel, be it federal agencies should channel resources towards that. Um, the second thing about that is so we have to look at eligibility requirements. For example, speaking about, for example, the DC Solar for All program. So we know, for example, that eligibility requirements definitely fall within the federal income poverty level threshold. And but what the DC Solar for All program is doing, which is very successful as a unique program, is we are also adding more. We're more inclusive in terms of increasing that threshold. So it's not like very static. So the approach or the mechanism that is used, and I think maybe other states can use that, it's not just, for example, this is a minimum income threshold who join the program qualify, but there's that re-evaluation of the program to see if it continues to meet the needs of the LMI population. And I think that is really super important. And the second thing that that the program is doing is that it has expanded even to the Hispanic population, because by recognizing the fact that there's just a broader perspective when it comes to the needs of the LMI population. So again, Brian, to your question, excellent question. The housing structure in America needs to improve, and the second aspect is just the affordability. And when we look at affordability, not only in terms of development, we should also think about affordability in terms of pricing and payment, because if not, then we're going to have a very large affordability gap.
So I am seeing another comment. Thank you, Elvis. Another comment from following up on the contract request, contract templates request for the Joe for Sun Falmouth project. And just want to, it says contract details that address key issues in the deployment and implementation would be helpful. Just want to address, this is super helpful feedback. As Elvis mentioned, the toolkit is a living resource, and not only in the maintenance of our data set, but we also want to ensure that the resources that we have on the site are relevant and long-term. And so, maybe we can't provide the specific Joe for Sun Falmouth templates, but we can definitely look into some of those templates, and I'll connect with you offline about connection with the leaders of that project. So more to come. We'll reach out to you. Elvis, I have a question for you that I'm curious about. How can developers implement some of these best practices in states where policies may not enable them as easily, knowing that some of these best practices are, potentially contingent on location, or any delays that are out of developers' hands? Do you speak to that?
Well, that's a good question, Sarah. Thank you for that. So first of all, we know we're in the post COVID period, and we know that there was the supply shock caused a lot of issues, and the regulatory framework with inflation and rising interest rate is not really also helping developers. But I want to speak from a goodwill perspective, as the CEO of Groundswell, Michelle Moore, always like to say, in that we serve our neighbors. We're really dedicated. We serve our neighbors as we serve ourselves. So there are two things here. So for states, for example, that don't currently have enabling legislation, so I think there are still opportunities for good projects to be developed. So let's take, for example, that a non-for-profit developer, with all the incentives that we've spoken about and the best practices, now wants to, for example, develop programs that improve energy efficiency. And this is super important, not only from a research perspective, but from Groundswell's work, even in cities such as Le Grange, for example, where we see that the housing stock has gone down and the age of the home. So there's a lot of energy efficiency program. Let's take that two examples. So there's energy efficiency component, and let's take an example of maybe another developer who may be interested in not energy efficiency, but resiliency in this case. We've been in states in the country where resiliency cannot be overemphasized, including the aspect of climate change. So I think these goodwill development projects, these efforts, be it driven by community-based organization, is going to propel policies to be enacted. So there are two things: either the policy already exists, or we can continue to create projects and create innovative practices that will enable more investment into some of these projects. So I think but that does not imply have a part to play. I think we should all embrace this. There's a sustainability component into it, and the long run effect, as I said at the beginning, that is the equity dimension, but there's also the climate change dimension to it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I love to keep picking your brain if I can. You kind of touched on this when we were talking about the IRA and the implementation phasing. What learnings can we still glean from these approaches? A lot of the project financing examples having to do with nonprofits not being able to directly leverage the ITC, and what is the best way to implement them in this kind of in-between phase that we're in as we see the IRA roll out?
Okay, so thank. That's another good question, Sarah. So there are two pathways. So directly and indirectly. So, and I know you spoke about the indirect component, but I'm just going to reiterate as well. So directly, by just taking advantage of the bill savings mechanism or the financing structure, because like for example, some of the projects you mentioned that they took advantage, they work with co-bank, and I also did mention about the Connecticut Solar for All program, how the Connecticut Green Bank was able to do that. So there are community development entities that are out there to be able to sponsor some of these projects. And so I want to just to encourage any non-for-profit developer out there that these opportunities are out, they're there. So let's take advantage of it, especially with the direct payment from the ICT, from the Inflation Reduction Act. Indirectly, when you explain, Sarah, about some of those successful projects, there's an indirect component there which involves partnership. And so, for example, by partnering, for example, with tax appetite organizations, that we can all join together to be able to do a great work. So I think this is a time right now where it doesn't really matter whether you're non-for-profit or you're a for-profit organization. The opportunities are out there. But how do we leverage this in a sustainable way is through partnership and collaboration in a very sustainable manner.
Wonderful. Thank you for walking us through that. I'm seeing one more question in the chat that we may have missed before. I'm part of a 501c3 retirement community that has gas and electric and some new construction perfect for solar. How do we get info to determine if solar would work for us?
Okay.
Any thoughts on that? I have some, but I'll let you go.
Okay, I can take the first step. Thanks so much for that question. I think let me not touch on what Sarah is about to say, but I think first of all, getting the community involved, and I think this is an exceptional opportunity. Whoever asks this question is an exceptional opportunity because this is where partnership stands. Get everyone involved. Like, okay, do we really want solar in our community? And just talk about the process, the benefit. Sarah did mention about the educational aspect there. Now, there's also the gas and electric aspect into it. And so this is where it comes into play with individual choices. For some new constructions can be only gas only or gas and electricity. So we need to look at it in terms of the cost by working in partnership with the local utility provider to be able to do some feasibility analysis to be able to access in terms of affordability. Does it make sense for this construction to have just gas or gas and electricity? But I would say for new construction in particular, that is why states like California mandate solar panels to be installed in every new home because it is very important. Personally speaking, in Virginia, I look at my energy consumption over the past year. I was shocked, and I'm here to say energy efficiency is a winner because I don't think I consume up to 7,000 kilowatts for a year. And that's just because my home is an energy efficiency home. So I have seen this not only from a research perspective, but I'm also living it. So I think it's a great opportunity to start having those discussions about making our communities. We need to take steps, but we need to be very inclusive as well.
Yeah, thanks, Elvis. And I would just add a little bit to that. I really appreciate that you started with that community engagement piece. I've been in just various circles in the past couple weeks. This conversation keeps coming up, and I think we need to treat this not as an afterthought, but really where it starts, where the process starts from. And if you don't have experience in that, it may seem challenging, difficult, but really it can be as simple as just getting someone on the ground who understands the community and can convey priorities in that way. And then, just shameless plug for the Lift Toolkit. Once you kind of have some of that initial assessment down and you have a little more of an idea around how your project might be financed, you can go and use the Lift Toolkit optimizer tool to kind of play around and learn from some similar projects that have similar circumstances to yours. With that being said, direct everyone to the Lift Toolkit. Great resource bank there. And I will now hand it back over to Alicia to close us out.
And thank you so much. And it was a pleasure to have everyone here today. And I hope you got a lot out of today's webinar. And if you know someone who may find information from this webinar meaningful, a recording of this webinar can be found on Groundswell's YouTube channel. And we also hope to see you at our next webinar in March. That'll actually be on the Investment Reduction Act tax credit and best practices for equitable community solar in regards to that. Let's have some great conversation. Until then, enjoy.